Detroit, Michigan. The roar of trucks thundered above the I-75 overpass, headlights cutting through the bitter night air. Beneath the concrete pillars where the cold seeped deep into the bones, an old woman curled up on a piece of cardboard. To most passers-by, she was invisible, a shadow among shadows, just another forgotten soul. But if anyone stopped long enough, they would notice her lips moving. Not in complaint, not in despair, but in prayer. Whispered words lifted to the Virgin Mary. They called her Cardboard Grandma. Every night, she pulled that worn piece of cardboard from beneath the bridge, spread it carefully on the ground, as if it were a sacred ritual, and knelt upon it. The traffic above drowned out most sounds, but her prayer carried on like a quiet flame in the wind. Holy Mother, thank you for another day. If I don't wake tomorrow, let it be in your arms. No house, no family, no warm meal. And yet in her eyes, there remained something unbreakable, a faith that refused to die. Detroit had seen homelessness before, but there was something different about her, an aura of peace, as if unseen hands were holding her up. That night seemed no different from the countless nights she had survived in silence. But soon, the piece of cardboard the world mocked as trash would become the very stage of a miracle. And before long, America would never look at the poor the same way again. Before she became known as Cardboard Grandma, her name was Margaret Johnson. At 72, her story had already carried more loss than most could endure. Margaret once had a life that looked ordinary, even hopeful. She had worked as a seamstress in Michigan, stitching wedding gowns and prom dresses for girls who dreamed of a brighter tomorrow. Her husband, Harold, was a quiet man with kind hands who spent his years on the assembly line at a car plant. Together, they built a modest home and filled it with plans for children, laughter, and stability. But life in Detroit does not always unfold as planned. The children never came. Doctors spoke of complications, treatments, and costs they could never afford. When Harold fell sick with cancer, Margaret sold her sewing machines and the house itself to cover bills. She sat by his bedside every night, holding his hand as his body grew weaker, whispering Hail Marys into the quiet. When he finally passed, Margaret was left with nothing but debts and memories. At first, she rented a small apartment, working odd jobs, cleaning houses, and babysitting. But arthritis stiffened her joints, diabetes stole her strength, and the little money she had vanished in prescriptions and overdue bills. By the time she was 70, the landlord knocked on her door with an eviction notice. With no children to help, no savings to cushion the fall, she stepped onto the streets carrying only a torn grocery bag filled with documents, a faded photo of Harold, and an old rosary her mother had given her. Detroit winters are unforgiving. The first nights outside cut through her like knives. She tried shelters, but they were overcrowded and unsafe. She tried asking for help from distant relatives, but their lives were already heavy with their own struggles. Slowly, she learned the unwritten rules of survival: where to find water, which churches served soup on Tuesdays, which alleys offered a few hours of quiet. Then came the day she found it, the cardboard. It had once been the packaging for a refrigerator tossed aside behind an appliance store. To everyone else, it was trash. To her, it was salvation. She folded it under her arm like treasure, and from then on, it became her bed, her shield, her closest companion. Every morning, she folded it with care, as if it were silk. Every night, she laid it out with the reverence of one preparing an altar. Some people mocked her as she walked by with the cardboard tucked under her arm. There goes the crazy old lady with her portable bed, they sneered. Others ignored her completely, the way city dwellers train themselves to ignore what makes them uncomfortable. Yet, even in the face of cruelty, Margaret's lips would form the same quiet words. Forgive them, Holy Mother. They don't see what you see. Her world had collapsed into a single piece of cardboard, and yet she guarded it with a dignity that no cold night, no cruel word, and no empty stomach could ever steal. Every night, when the city lights dimmed and the bitter wind settled under the overpass, Margaret knelt down on her piece of cardboard. The pavement was hard, the air damp with the smell of gasoline and rust. But her prayer rose above it all. She did not beg for money or food. She did not ask for a warm apartment or new clothes. Instead, her voice, thin, cracked, but steady, whispered the same words. Holy Mother, thank you for another day. If I don't wake tomorrow, let it be in your arms. Truck drivers passing above never knew that beneath them, a 72-year-old woman was praying with a devotion most church pews never see. Sometimes other homeless souls shuffled past her and paused, surprised by the sight. They would see her knees pressing into cold cement, her wrinkled hands clutching a rosary with missing beads, her eyes closed in peace. Some laughed at her, shaking their heads. Others lingered quietly, unsettled by the strength radiating from such weakness. Margaret never preached. She never told others what to believe. She simply prayed aloud, her words drifting like incense in the night. And in those whispered prayers, she carried the names of strangers, other women in line at the soup kitchen, men coughing through sleepless nights, children she had never met. Each night she entrusted them to the Virgin Mary, convinced that the mother who once stood at the foot of the cross still stooped down to comfort the forgotten. There were times when hunger clawed so fiercely at her stomach that her whole body trembled. On those nights, temptation whispered, "Why keep praying? Has anyone answered you?" Yet every time doubt rose up, Margaret would press the rosary to her lips and remember her mother's voice from decades past. Mary never abandons her children, even when the world does. That faith did not remove the pain. It did not magically bring food or warmth, but it wrapped her in a strange serenity that startled those who mocked her. One police officer once kicked her cardboard and barked, "Move along. You're not welcome here." Margaret simply gathered her belongings and said, "God bless you, son. May the Virgin watch over you." The officer froze, disarmed by words he did not expect. Her life was stripped bare. No house, no family, no possessions worth stealing. Yet each night, her cardboard became more than bedding. It became an altar, a sanctuary where heaven touched the earth. Margaret had nothing left to give except the one thing the world could not take away, her unshakable faith in the Virgin Mary. It was on one of Detroit's coldest mornings when hunger gnawed at Margaret's insides like a knife. She had found a stale dinner roll in a trash bin behind a diner, her only meal in 2 days. She held it close, her fingers trembling with both cold and need. Every part of her body begged her to eat. That's when she saw him. A pit bull, ribs jutting out like fragile sticks beneath its skin, staggered into the alley. Its eyes were wild, desperate, and it growled at the sight of the bread in her hand. Most people would have thrown rocks, shouted, or run away. Margaret did none of these. She simply stood still, meeting the animal's gaze with a calmness that seemed out of place. The dog crept closer, teeth bared, ready to fight for survival. Slowly, Margaret broke the bread in half. Her voice, fragile but gentle, carried through the icy air. "Here, little one, you're hungry too." She laid the piece on the ground and slid it toward him. The dog sniffed, snatched it up, and dashed into the shadows. Margaret sat back down on her cardboard, her stomach roaring with disappointment. She pressed her hands against her chest and whispered, "Holy Mother, I'll be fine. He needed it more than me." What she didn't know was that someone had seen it. Across the street, leaning against his van, a local news reporter named David Lopez had been filming a story about crime in the neighborhood. His camera caught everything: the gaunt dog, the trembling woman, and the moment she gave away her only food. David lowered his camera slowly. Stunned. In years of covering violence, corruption, and loss, he had rarely seen something so quietly heroic. For Margaret, it was nothing extraordinary. She had always believed that every creature, human or animal, belonged to God and was watched over by the Virgin Mary. Sharing her bread was simply natural, even if it meant she would go hungry. But for David, and soon for the world, this single act of kindness would become the spark that lit a fire far greater than Margaret could imagine. December in Detroit carried a cruel wind. On that day, the city square downtown was buzzing with noise. A stage had been set up beneath banners that read Detroit Renewal Initiative. Local politicians and businessmen stood in crisp suits, their voices echoing through loudspeakers, promising to end poverty, to restore dignity, to bring hope to the city. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes. School children were lined up in clean uniforms to clap at the right moments. At the edge of the crowd, unnoticed at first, stood Margaret. Her cardigan was frayed, her shoes patched with duct tape, and her cardboard folded neatly under her arm like a flag of her identity. She didn't push forward, didn't shout. She simply stood there with her faint smile, listening as men in expensive coats declared a war on homelessness, while never once looking in her eyes. Then it happened. From a stage, one of the visiting businessmen pointed in her direction. His microphone caught his words, magnifying them for all to hear. "And what about that old woman over there? Is she the future we're talking about?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. The mayor smirked and leaned into the microphone. She's been around for years, sleeps on cardboard under the bridge. Some people just can't be helped. The laughter grew louder. A city official added, I once saw her eating scraps out of a dumpster behind KFC. That's her level. The cruelty was amplified through the sound system, crashing down on Margaret like hailstones. She lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning, but her dignity did not falter. She clutched her cardboard tighter as if it were armor. The crowd, emboldened by the officials, jeered openly, then, as if to drive the humiliation deeper. A woman in a red designer coat stepped off the stage. She carried a plate from the buffet table, a thick sandwich stacked with meat and cheese. Cameras turned, capturing the spectacle. The woman smiled for the press and said, Here you go, Grandma. You must be starving. Margaret's eyes lit up. Her wrinkled hands reached forward with genuine gratitude. But just before they touched the sandwich, the woman let it fall. It hit the pavement with a sickening splat, the bread splitting, the fillings scattering into dirt. Oops, the woman said with a laugh that never touched her eyes. She pressed the heel of her designer boot into the sandwich, grinding into the concrete. But you're used to eating off the ground, aren't you? Go ahead, pick it up. The crowd howled with laughter. Phones came out. A photographer snapped the moment. The old woman kneeling before trampled food, but Margaret did not curse, did not lash out. Slowly, with the delicacy of one gathering flowers for an altar, she picked up each piece of the ruined sandwich. Her hands shook, not from shame, but from age and hunger. She brushed off the dirt with the hem of her dress, tucking the broken meal into her torn plastic bag. Her lips moved, but no one heard the words except perhaps heaven itself. Forgive them, Holy Mother. They don't know what they do. The laughter rolled on, sharp and merciless, until she disappeared into the market stalls. For the politicians, the show went on. Promises, speeches, statistics. For the crowd, the incident became a cruel joke to retell later. But not everyone laughed. In the shadows at the back of the square, a man with a camera stood frozen. Reporter David Lopez had seen violence and tragedy in his career, but never had he witnessed such quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation. His finger pressed record, capturing every second. He didn't know it yet, but this video would shake America and change Margaret's life forever. That night, in a small apartment on the east side of Detroit, reporter David Lopez sat alone at his desk. The glow of his computer screen illuminated his tired face as he replayed the footage again and again. He had covered shootings, fires, and political scandals, but none of them had pierced him the way this did. On the screen, Margaret bent to the ground, her frail body framed by jeering faces. He watched the sandwich fall, watched the heel crush it, watched her gather the pieces with trembling dignity. Each time, the same knot tightened in his chest. He opened his editing software, trimmed the clip, and muted the voices of the officials. He wanted no distractions, no villains, no names, only her. In simple text, he typed across the screen, Cardboard Grandma. True dignity cannot be destroyed. At 11:47 p.m., he pressed upload. The video went to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all his accounts. He had less than 1,000 followers combined. He expected a few likes, maybe a handful of shares. Then he shut his laptop and went to bed. By sunrise, his phone would not stop buzzing. Notifications flooded his screen faster than he could read them. The clip had exploded. Hundreds of thousands of views in hours, millions by the end of the day. By lunchtime, the hashtag jar and Cardboard Grandma was trending nationwide. The comments poured in. I'm crying at 6 a.m. This woman has more grace than anyone I know. I'm not religious, but this feels holy. She's an angel among us. How can we find her? How can we help? Influencers reposted it. Celebrities tweeted it. News anchors referenced it on morning shows. The video crossed borders, appearing on feeds in London, Paulo, and Seoul. But beyond numbers and views, something deeper stirred. People didn't just watch, they acted. Donations to shelters surged. Volunteers signed up at soup kitchens. Strangers stopped to hand blankets and food to the homeless in their neighborhoods. And all of it traced back to one frail woman folding her dignity into a piece of cardboard under a Detroit bridge. What Margaret didn't know as she prayed that night under the freeway with her rosary in hand was that her prayer had already been answered. The Virgin Mary had taken her story, her humiliation, her cardboard bed, and turned it into a light for the whole world to see. By the afternoon of the third day, the video had surpassed 20 million views. Television anchors debated it. podcasts dissected it, and churches across America played it during Sunday sermons. Yet, one question echoed everywhere. Who is she? Reporters scoured Detroit, waving screenshots from the viral clip. Volunteers from local parishes, social workers, and even strangers who had seen the video online began walking the streets asking the same question. Do you know this woman, the one with the cardboard? The answers were divided. Some rolled their eyes. Oh, her. She's crazy. Always talking to herself, praying to Mary like somebody's listening. Waste of time. Others softened. She's kind. She once gave me half her soup when I was sick. I've seen her blessing kids as they walk to school. She never asked for anything. Finally, a street vendor near a bus stop leaned over his cart of newspapers and pointed under the highway. She sleeps down there every night. Folks call her Cardboard Grandma. Real name Margaret, I think. That evening, reporter David Lopez returned to the very bridge where he had first seen her. But he wasn't alone this time. With him came two fellow journalists, a pair of social workers carrying blankets and food, and a woman named Elena, a representative of a Catholic foundation from Chicago. She had taken the first flight to Detroit after watching the video, determined to meet the woman whose faith had touched her heart. They found Margaret exactly as described, curled up on her cardboard, clutching her worn grocery bag, a rosary dangling from her fingers. When she stirred awake and saw the small group standing nearby, her first instinct was fear. She struggled to sit up, whispering, "I'm sorry. Am I in your way? I'll move." David's voice cracked as he knelt beside her. "No, ma'am. Please don't move. We can't find you." Margaret blinked in confusion. She had lived invisible for so long, she couldn't imagine why strangers, well-dressed, kind-eyed strangers would be searching for her. And in that moment, as cameras quietly recorded, the story of Cardboard Grandma shifted. For the first time in years, Margaret was no longer hidden beneath a bridge. She was seen. For a moment, Margaret thought it was a dream. The lights, the faces, the kind voices. It all felt like something her mind had invented to soften the loneliness of another night under the bridge. But as David helped her sit up, and Elena draped a blanket over her shoulders, she realized it was real. "Why are you here?" Margaret asked, her voice fragile. "I'm just an old woman with a piece of cardboard." Elena knelt beside her, taking her hand. "No, Margaret, you're the woman who reminded the world what dignity looks like. Millions of people have seen you. They're not laughing. They're praying, donating, asking how they can help. They want to meet the woman who never lost her faith." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. She shook her head slowly. "I don't understand. I didn't do anything special. I only prayed to the Blessed Mother and tried to share what little I had." The group invited her to a nearby church hall where a priest had opened the doors for warmth and privacy. Cameras waited outside, but inside was quiet, lit by the soft glow of votive candles. Margaret looked around as though she were stepping into heaven itself. The priest, Father Michael, placed a plate of hot food in front of her. Margaret's hands trembled as she folded them first in prayer. "Thank you, Holy Mother," she whispered before taking the first bite. That night, while she slept in a real bed for the first time in years, something extraordinary began to unfold. Donations poured in. First hundreds, then thousands, then millions. A Catholic foundation announced a national fund for the homeless in her name. Volunteers flooded Detroit streets with blankets, food, and medicine. News anchors described her as the soul of America's conscience. But the most remarkable moment came the next morning. Margaret awoke in the parish guest room. The cardboard she had carried for years folded neatly by her bedside. She reached for her rosary, knelt, and prayed as always. Suddenly, the room filled with a warmth unlike any heat from the radiator. Margaret later described it as a mother's embrace wrapping around me. She lifted her gaze toward the small statue of the Virgin Mary on the dresser. For an instant, the statue seemed alive, eyes tender, lips almost moving. Margaret swore she heard a voice not with her ears, but with her heart. "My daughter, you have given when you had nothing. You have shared when you were hungry. Now watch as my son multiplies what you offered. You are not forgotten. You will be my hands for those still lost on the streets." Margaret wept, clutching the rosary tight against her chest. Whether it was vision, dream, or grace, she knew the Blessed Mother had spoken, and she believed every word. Later that day, in a press conference crowded with reporters, Elena announced the creation of Mary's Hope for All, a foundation dedicated to building shelters and soup kitchens across the country. And when asked who would lead it, she turned and pointed to Margaret. Gasps filled the room. Cameras flashed. Margaret, bewildered, shook her head. No, I'm not fit. I'm just an old woman. But Elena smiled. That's exactly why. Because you never forgot where you came from, and because your faith through the Virgin Mary is already changing the world. Margaret finally nodded, but with one condition. Let me sleep on my cardboard once a week, so I never forget the bridge, the cold, and those still waiting for their miracle. The room fell silent, and in that silence, the miracle had truly arrived. Within weeks, the effects of Mary's hope for all could be seen on the streets of Detroit. The first shelter opened in a renovated church basement offering 50 clean beds, hot meals, and medical care. Lines stretched around the block, but unlike other shelters, there was no shouting, no fear. People entered with heads held a little higher because they knew this place was built not from pity, but from love. Margaret insisted on being there every morning. She didn't sit in an office or sign papers from afar. At dawn, she would arrive with her simple coat and that familiar piece of cardboard tucked under her arm. Volunteers watched in awe as she greeted each person by name, even when she'd met them only once. Good morning, Robert. How's your cough today? Teresa. Did your grandson get the shoes we found for him? God bless you, Mark. The Virgin hasn't forgotten you. For those living on the edge of despair, hearing their names spoken with such tenderness was more healing than the soup or the medicine. Soon, soup kitchens began to pop up, not just in Detroit, but in Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. A mobile medical van staffed by Catholic doctors made rounds under bridges, checking blood pressure, treating infections, offering hope where hospitals had long stopped coming. But perhaps the most radical change wasn't in buildings or programs. It was in the hearts of the people. Merchants who once chased Margaret away from their stores now set aside food donations every evening. Children from nearby schools organized blanket drives instead of bake sales. Neighbors who had walked past the homeless for years now stopped, smiled, and asked, "How are you today?" Detroit began to feel different. What was once a city hardened by decline and violence started to soften at the edges. Reporters called it the Margaret Effect. Priests preached about it in homilies. Local leaders who had laughed at her before now quoted her words on television. And through it all, Margaret kept her vow. One night each week, she left the shelter's warmth, returned to her old spot under the I-75 overpass, and laid out her cardboard. Some thought it strange, even foolish, but to Margaret, it was sacred. If I forget the bridge, she said softly, I'll forget the one still out here. And the Blessed Mother didn't lift me up so I could turn my back. For the city of Detroit, the miracle was no longer just a viral video. It had become a movement. One woman's faith multiplied into thousands of acts of kindness, reshaping a community from the inside out. What began under a Detroit bridge soon leapt far beyond the city limits. News stations across the United States replayed the clip of Margaret gathering her crushed sandwich with quiet dignity, her lips whispering prayers to the Virgin. Late-night hosts spoke about her, not with sarcasm, but with awe. Then the story crossed oceans. In London, newspapers ran headlines, "Cardboard Grandma teaches the world dignity." In Brazil, bishops preached about her faith during Sunday Massachusetts. In the Philippines, entire congregations lit candles before statues of Mary, praying for Margaret and the movement she had inspired. The Catholic Church recognized something unique in her witness. What no encyclical or policy paper could achieve, Margaret's simple faith had done. She had reminded millions that poverty was not statistics, but faces, not numbers, but names. Invitations began arriving. Universities asked her to speak. Nonprofits requested her guidance. But the most surprising call came from New York. The United Nations wanted her to address the General Assembly during a session on human dignity. Margaret hesitated. No speaker. I don't know the language of politicians. But Father Michael encouraged her. You don't need polished words. You only need the truth of your heart. That's what the world is longing for. On the day of her speech, the Grand Hall of the UN stood silent as Margaret, dressed in her simple coat, stepped to the podium. In her hands, she carried not a script, but the folded piece of cardboard that had been her bed. Her voice trembled at first, but then steadied. Good morning. My name is Margaret Johnson. For 2 years, this cardboard was my home under a bridge in Detroit. People laughed at me, stepped over me, called me useless. But the Virgin Mary never turned her face away. She taught me that poverty is not the absence of money. It is the absence of love. And love can be restored if we dare to see one another as family. When she finished, the hall erupted in applause. Delegates from dozens of nations stood to their feet. many with tears streaming down their faces. Margaret had not delivered a political plan. She had delivered a mother's reminder, echoing Mary's own heart, that no one is forgotten. After her speech at the United Nations, Margaret could no longer walk unnoticed through a crowd. Yet, she remained the same woman who folded her cardboard carefully each night. She refused luxury, choosing instead to live simply so that the mission could grow. With the surge of donations and support, the foundation launched its boldest initiative, Cardboard University of Mary. It wasn't a traditional school. There were no ivy-covered walls or lecture halls. Instead, the professors were men and women who had once slept on sidewalks and subway stations under bridges. People who knew suffering firsthand. The curriculum was unlike any in the world. How to forgive when you've been wronged. How to share when you have nothing left. How to find dignity when the world calls you worthless. How to see the Virgin's presence in the darkest nights. Students included business executives, college graduates, priests, and even politicians. They sat shoulder to shoulder with the poor, listening as former addicts, veterans, and single mothers spoke about resilience and faith. For many, it was the first time they saw poverty not as an abstract issue, but as a teacher. Across America, people began to change. Employers created second-chance programs to hire the homeless. High schools required students to volunteer at shelters. Families who once ignored beggars now carried food in their cars to hand out at intersections. Soon the movement spread globally. In Mexico City, homeless shelters displayed cardboard signs painted with the phrase that had become the university's motto, "Those who give when they have nothing will receive without measure." In Madrid, a parish converted its parish hall into a cardboard classroom. In Nairobi, children wrote Margaret's name on their notebooks, calling her Grandma of Hope. The media called it a revolution of compassion, but Margaret always redirected the credit. "Don't look at me," she told a reporter from CNN. "Look at the Blessed Mother. She is the one who taught me to keep loving even when I had nothing." Her story touched not only individuals, but also entire systems. City governments reconsidered how they treated the homeless. Churches renewed their outreach. Universities studied her as a case in ethics and theology. Through it all, Margaret remained grounded. Every week, she still slept one night under a bridge, laying out her cardboard with reverence. Volunteers sometimes joined her, placing their own pieces beside hers in solidarity. It became a ritual of remembrance that miracles do not begin in palaces, but in forgotten corners where faith clings to survival. By the time Margaret turned 80, the phrase Cardboard University of Mary had become a symbol worldwide. It stood not just for one woman's story, but for a global awakening, the rediscovery that dignity does not depend on wealth, but on love. And at the center of it all was an elderly woman with silver hair, a fragile body, and eyes that still shone with childlike faith, living proof that the Virgin had indeed transformed cardboard into a beacon of hope. Margaret lived to see her 82nd year. Her hair turned completely white. Her steps grew slower, but her eyes still carried the same light that had once burned beneath the I-75 bridge. The world now called her the richest woman alive, not because of money, but because of the love she had multiplied across nations. Her final years were a mixture of global recognition and personal humility. She met presidents, received humanitarian awards, and even stood on the stage in Oslo as the Nobel Peace Prize was placed in her hands. Yet when reporters asked what the honor meant to her, she lifted her cardboard and replied, "This is my real prize. This is where the Virgin Mary found me." On cold Detroit nights, she still returned to her bridge once a week. Volunteers and former homeless friends often joined her, spreading their own cardboard beside hers. To them, it was no longer a sign of poverty, but of solidarity. Margaret would smile and whisper, "Remember, the Blessed Mother walked with me here first, and she walks with you too." The day of her passing came quietly. She had insisted, as always, on sleeping one more night under the bridge. Wrapped in a thin blanket, the cardboard beneath her, she prayed her familiar words, "Holy Mother, thank you for another day. If I don't wake tomorrow, let it be in your arms." And when dawn arrived, she did not wake. News of her death swept the world. In Detroit, thousands filled the streets carrying pieces of cardboard with prayers written on them. In Mexico City, Manila, Rome, and Nairobi, candlelight vigils burned through the night. Social media lit up with a single phrase, "We are all cardboard grandchildren." Her funeral was the largest Detroit had seen in generations. Homeless men in donated suits walked beside CEOs in tailored jackets. Children carried flowers. Choirs sang mass and hymns. And when a casket passed, people raised their pieces of cardboard high, turning the city into a sea of makeshift altars. The Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. requested her original cardboard. It now rests in a glass case with a bronze plaque, the bed of the woman who taught the world that true wealth is love. Yet her legacy did not end with memorials. The Cardboard University of Mary continued to expand, reaching 50 countries within a decade. Homeless individuals became teachers, communities became families, and governments reshaped policies with dignity at their core. And through every new shelter, every classroom, every meal served, Margaret's spirit lived on. Years later, a little girl in Detroit was asked what she wanted to be when she grew up. Without hesitation, she held up a folded piece of cardboard and said, "I want to be like Grandma Margaret. I want to help the Virgin change the world." The story of Margaret Johnson, Cardboard Grandma, proved something the world had nearly forgotten. Miracles are not rare spectacles reserved for the powerful. They are born in ordinary choices, sharing a crust of bread, forgiving cruelty, praying on cold pavement. And sometimes, the Virgin Mary uses the weakest vessel to show the greatest strength. Margaret died on a piece of cardboard, but she lives forever in the countless lives she touched, the dignity she restored, and the love she multiplied. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful story of faith, dignity, and the gentle hand of the Virgin Mary. If Margaret's journey touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs hope today, and don't forget to subscribe to Touched by Grace. Together, let's keep spreading stories that remind the world miracles still happen.